the arrival of the unexpected. The stars outside the viewport of Station Prime looked peaceful, but Ambassador Velix knew better. His crystalline body refracted nervous patterns of light as he waited in the grand reception hall. For 300 cycles, the Galactic Assembly had maintained order across 12,000 systems. They had treaties, protocols, and civilized ways of handling disputes. But none of that mattered now. The Chronari were different. They didn't negotiate. They didn't follow rules. They appeared from dark space, stripped entire planets of resources, and vanished before any fleet could respond. 47 worlds had fallen silent in the past cycle alone. The Assembly's combined military forces, despite their advanced technology, moved too slowly, thought too carefully, planned too long. By the time they arrived, only dead worlds remained. That's why they had sent the message to Earth, the newest member of the galactic community, barely 50 years since first contact. The Assembly Council had debated for days before making the decision. Earth was primitive by their standards, still using chemical propulsion for most of their vessels, still divided into separate nations on their homeworld. But they had something the rest of the galaxy had lost over millennia of civilization. They still knew how to fight dirty. The docking alert chimed through the station. Velix straightened his form, preparing to meet Earth's military delegation. The other ambassadors gathered behind him, representing the greatest civilizations in known space. The Etherians floated in their biosuits. The Machina stood in perfect geometric formation, and the Verdanti's root-like appendages gripped the floor with anticipation. The airlock cycled open. One human walked through. She wasn't wearing a uniform, at least not one that Velix recognized. Faded cargo pants, a tank top that showed muscular arms covered in scars, and combat boots that had seen better decades. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple tie. She carried no weapons that he could see, just a beaten-up backpack slung over one shoulder. The ambassadors exchanged confused harmonics. Where was the fleet? Where were the generals and admirals? Where was the army Earth had promised to send? The human walked up to Velix and held out her hand. He knew this gesture from his cultural briefings and extended his appendage to shake it. Her grip was firm, calloused. "Major Elena Vasquez," she said. Her voice was raspy, like she'd spent years shouting over explosions. "Earth Defense Force Unconventional Warfare Division. I understand you have a pest problem." Velix's light patterns flickered with confusion. "Major, we were expecting an army?" Elena finished for him. She looked around the grand hall, taking in the assembly of alien dignitaries. "Yeah, I got that from your message. Thing is, armies are for fighting wars. What you've got isn't a war. It's an infestation. And you don't send an army to deal with pests. You send an exterminator." Ambassador Thrain of the Machina stepped forward, his metallic form humming with indignation. "The Chronari have destroyed 47 worlds. They command a fleet of over 10,000 vessels. How can one human possibly—" Elena dropped her backpack on the polished floor with a thud that echoed through the hall. "You ever hear of the Vietnam War?" The ambassadors processed their translation matrices. Several shook their heads or performed their species equivalent gesture. "Figured not. Ancient history even by our standards. Here's the short version. The most powerful military on Earth went to fight in a jungle against farmers with outdated weapons. The military had every advantage. Better tech, more soldiers, unlimited resources. They lost." She pulled out a chair from the conference table and sat down, putting her boots up on the pristine surface. "You know why they lost?" The ambassadors were silent, transfixed by this strange human's casual disregard for protocol. Because the farmers weren't fighting by the same rules. They didn't form battle lines or follow conventional tactics. They used the jungle, they used fear, they used the enemy's strengths against them. Elena pulled out a tablet from her bag, its screen cracked, but functional. "I've been reading your reports on the way here. Everything about the Chronari, how they think, how they move, what they want. You've been trying to fight them like civilized people. That's your first mistake." "Then what do you propose?" Velix asked, his curiosity overcoming his concern about proper diplomatic channels. Elena smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "The Chronari are raiders, right? They hit soft targets, take what they want, and run. They're basically bullies with spaceships, and there's only one way to deal with bullies." She stood up and walked to the strategic display that showed the positions of recent Chronari attacks. "You make them afraid." Ambassador Lyra of the Etherians rippled with distress. "The Assembly does not use fear as a weapon. We are civilized beings who—" Who are watching your people get slaughtered because you're too civilized to get your hands dirty, Elena interrupted. Listen, I respect your principles. Really, I do. But your principles aren't going to bring back those 47 worlds. Your principles aren't going to stop the Chronari from taking 47 more. She turned to face them all, and for the first time, Felix truly looked at her. The scars weren't just on her arms. They covered what he could see of her body, some old and faded, others relatively fresh. Her eyes held something that made his crystalline structure resonate with an unfamiliar frequency. This wasn't just a soldier. This was someone who had seen the worst the universe could offer and had survived it. You called Earth because you heard stories, Elena continued. Stories about how we fought each other for thousands of years. How we nearly destroyed our own planet multiple times. How we're the only species in the assembly that still has active military forces, even after joining your peaceful federation. You called us because deep down you know that sometimes civilization isn't enough. She pulled something from her pocket. It was a small device, no bigger than Velix's smallest appendage. This is a quantum virus I had our tech boys cook up during the journey here. It's based on something we used to use back on Earth called a logic bomb. But this one's special. It doesn't destroy systems or kill anyone. It does something much worse. Wait, what does it do? Thrain asked, his sensors focused intently on the device. It makes them doubt, Elena said simply. Every decision, every order, every thought. It introduces a random delay between thinking and acting. Just a few seconds, but in combat, a few seconds is the difference between victory and destruction. The Chronari pride themselves on their quick strikes and instant coordination. Take that away and they're just scared raiders floating in space. The ambassadors began talking among themselves in their various languages. Felix could hear the fear in their tones, not of the Chronari but of this human and what she represented. But that's just phase 1, Elena continued, ignoring their discussions. Phase 2 is where it gets interesting. See, I did some research on your previous attempts to fight them. You always send your best ships, your most advanced technology. The Chronari scan them, learn from them, adapt. So we're going to give them something different to scan. She pulled up an image on her tablet and projected it onto the main display. It showed a ship, but unlike anything in the Assembly's fleet, it was ugly, asymmetrical, and looked like it had been assembled from salvage. This is the Frankenstein, Elena announced with what seemed like pride. We built it from the wreckage of every species the Chronari have defeated. 63 different technologies that shouldn't work together but do. When they try to scan it, their systems won't know what to make of it. It'll be like trying to understand a conversation where every word is from a different language. Felix found himself leaning forward. And you plan to pilot this vessel alone? Hell no, Elena laughed. I'm good, but I'm not that good. That's phase 3. You've got thousands of refugees from the destroyed worlds, right? People who lost everything to the Chronari. I'm going to recruit them. Not your soldiers who follow rules and protocols. I want the angry ones, the broken ones, the ones who have nothing left to lose. That's not how the Assembly conducts military operations, Lyra protested weakly. Exactly, Elena agreed. And that's why it's going to work. The Chronari know how you fight. They've studied you, planned for you, adapted to you. But they've never faced humans. They've never faced people who grew up on a death world where everything tried to kill us, where we had to fight for every scrap of civilization we built. They've never faced people who turned warfare into a science and then into an art form. She picked up her backpack and slung it over her shoulder again. I need 3 days to review all your intelligence on the Chronari. Then I need access to your refugee camps to recruit my team. After that, I need you to do the hardest thing you've ever done. What? Felix asked. Nothing, Elena said. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear, no matter how wrong it looks, you do nothing. You let me work. Because the moment you try to civilize what I'm about to do, those 47 worlds become 100. She started walking toward the door, then stopped and turned back. Oh, and Ambassador Velix? You might want to prepare your people for something. What's that? Humans don't fight wars to win. We fight wars to end them permanently. The Chronari are about to learn the difference. The human solution. The refugee camp on Station 7 was a place where hope went to die. Elena walked through the crowded corridors, observing the survivors of Chronari attacks. They huddled in groups based on species, each carrying the weight of destroyed worlds in their eyes. The assembly provided food, shelter, and medical care, but they couldn't provide what these people really needed. Purpose, revenge, a reason to keep living. Elena had spent 3 days studying every piece of intelligence the Assembly had on the Chronari. Their attack patterns, their technology, their communication methods, but most importantly, their psychology. The Chronari weren't just raiders. They were supremacists who believed that taking from lesser species was their divine right. They had built their entire culture around the idea that might makes right. She stopped at a corner where a Theranian sat alone. His species was known for their peaceful nature, their ability to photosynthesize making them the gardeners of the galaxy. But this one's leaves were dark, almost black with grief. His world had been one of the first to fall. "You're Korvac," Elena said, reading from her tablet. "Former agricultural specialist on Theron Prime." He looked up at her with dim photoreceptors. "I am nothing now. My groves are ash. My seedlings are dead." Elena sat down next to him on the cold metal floor. "The Chronari took your world. They killed your people. They destroyed everything you loved." She wasn't trying to comfort him. She was stating facts. "The Assembly wants to give you a new start somewhere else. Plant new groves, grow new seedlings, pretend it never happened." "How dare you?" Korvac started, his leaves rustling with anger. "But I'm not the Assembly," Elena continued. "I'm here to offer you something different. A chance to make the Chronari understand what they took from you. Not through words or treaties, but through action." She stood and raised her voice so others could hear. "I'm looking for people who are done being victims. People who want to fight back but don't know how. I can't promise you'll survive. I can't promise we'll win. But I can promise you this. The Chronari will learn that some species don't just roll over and die." Within an hour, she had 30 volunteers. Not soldiers, but engineers, medics, teachers, farmers. People who had never held weapons but were willing to learn. The Assembly observers were horrified. These weren't warriors. They were civilians. Broken civilians. That's exactly what Elena wanted. The Frankenstein sat in docking bay 9 like a predator pretending to be prey. Elena had spent 2 days with Assembly engineers, combining technologies that theoretically couldn't coexist. Etherian biocircuits connected to Machina quantum processors. Verdanti organic hull plating welded to Terran steel. The ship was an impossibility that somehow functioned. "This is insane," muttered Grax, a Saurian engineer who had volunteered after the Chronari destroyed his colony. "These systems shouldn't even be able to communicate with each other." "That's the point," Elena explained, running her hand along a section of hull that seemed to shift between solid and liquid. "The Chronari's strength is their ability to analyze and adapt to any technology they encounter. So we give them something that can't be analyzed because it doesn't make sense." She gathered her unlikely crew in the ship's cargo hold, which had been converted into a training area. Most of them had never fought, never killed, never even raised their voices in anger before their worlds burned. "Listen up," Elena announced. "The Assembly would spend months training you in proper combat techniques, teaching you discipline, formation fighting, honor in battle. We don't have months, and honor doesn't win wars. So instead, I'm going to teach you the 3 rules that kept humans alive on a world that wanted us dead." She held up one finger. "Rule 1, there's no such thing as a fair fight. If you're fighting fair, you're fighting wrong. Use every advantage, every trick, every dirty move you can think of. 2 fingers. Rule 2, the enemy's strength is also their weakness. The Chronari are fast. Make them run into traps. They're coordinated. Disrupt their communications. They're confident. Make them paranoid. 3 fingers. Rule 3, survival isn't about being the strongest or the smartest. It's about being the most adaptable. The Chronari expect military tactics from military ships, so we're going to give them something else entirely." Over the next week, Elena transformed her crew of refugees into something the galaxy had never seen. Not soldiers, but guerrilla fighters. She taught the Theranians to use their photosynthetic abilities to create toxic spores that would clog Chronari air filters. The Saurians learned to use their natural heat resistance to sabotage enemy power cores. The Etherians discovered that their bioenergy could create feedback loops in Chronari scanning systems. But more importantly, she taught them to think like humans, to be unpredictable, chaotic, willing to do whatever it took to survive. The first test came sooner than expected. Long-range sensors detected a Chronari raid fleet approaching a mining colony in the outer reaches. 300 ships moving in perfect formation, ready to strip another world bare. Elena stood on the bridge of the Frankenstein looking at her crew. They were terrified. "Good. Fear kept you sharp, kept you alive. Remember," she said, "we're not here to fight them ship to ship. We're here to break them psychologically. Korvac, are the spores ready? The Thuranian, his leaves now showing hints of healthy green again, nodded. 12,000 pods ready for deployment. Grax, status on the virus. Loaded into every probe and communication buoy we could find, the Saurian reported. The moment they scan anything, it'll start spreading through their network. Elena smiled that dangerous smile again. Then let's introduce the Chronari to psychological warfare, human style. The Frankenstein dropped out of hyperspace not in front of the Chronari fleet but behind it. Where no sane military vessel would position itself, the Chronari command ship immediately attempted to scan them. And that's when everything went wrong. The ship's impossibly mixed technologies created a feedback loop that surged through the Chronari's sensors. Not enough to damage them, but enough to cause confusion. Error messages flooded their systems. How could one ship be reading as 60 different configurations simultaneously? While they tried to make sense of the readings, Elena's crew launched the spore pods. Not at the Chronari ships, but into space around them. The pods burst, creating a cloud of bioluminescent particles that did nothing harmful but made their sensors useless. The Chronari were flying blind. Then the virus hit. It had been hidden in the sensor feedback, spreading through their network faster than their systems could identify it. Suddenly, every order took 3 seconds longer to process. Every reaction was delayed. Their perfect coordination began to fracture. But Elena wasn't done. She broadcast a message on all frequencies, not in Galactic Standard, but in ancient Earth languages, Latin, Mandarin, Swahili, Navajo, switching between them randomly. The Chronari translation systems went haywire trying to process it all. And then the psychological masterstroke. Hidden in the spore cloud were holographic projectors, each showing images of the worlds the Chronari had destroyed. But not as they were when they died, as they were when they lived. Children playing, forests growing, oceans teeming with life. The images surrounded the Chronari fleet, forcing them to fly through the ghosts of their victims. The raid fleet, which had never encountered resistance like this, began to fracture. Some ships tried to maintain formation while others broke off to escape the sensory chaos. Their command structure, dependent on instant communication and coordination, collapsed. Elena watched as panic spread through the enemy fleet. This wasn't a military defeat. The Chronari ships were undamaged, their weapons still functional. But psychologically, they were broken. They had never faced an enemy that fought without rules, without predictable patterns, without honor. Phase 2, Elena ordered. The Frankenstein broadcast another signal, this one directed at the mining colony. It was simple. Run. Now. The colony ships, which had been preparing for death, suddenly found themselves with an escape route as the Chronari fleet fell into chaos. They fled while their attackers were still trying to understand what was happening. But the real victory came 3 days later. The Chronari raid fleet, the same force that had destroyed 47 worlds, retreated. Not because they were defeated militarily, but because they were afraid. For the first time in their history, they had encountered something they couldn't understand, couldn't adapt to, couldn't defeat through superior force. The news spread through the galaxy like wildfire. A single ship with a crew of refugees had turned back a Chronari fleet without firing a single weapon. The assembly was horrified and amazed in equal measure, but Elena wasn't finished. In the weeks that followed, she taught her tactics to other refugee groups. Not the assembly's ordered military forces, but the broken, the angry, the desperate. She showed them that victory didn't always mean destruction. Sometimes it meant making your enemy too afraid to fight. The Chronari tried to adapt, but how do you adapt to chaos? How do you plan for an enemy that doesn't follow plans? Every time they thought they understood human tactics, the tactics changed. Sometimes it was biological warfare using weaponized music that disrupted their neural patterns. Sometimes it was computer viruses that made their ships sing human opera. Sometimes it was nothing at all, just the threat of attack that kept them paralyzed with indecision. Within 6 months, the Chronari raids had stopped entirely. Not because they were defeated, but because they were terrified. They had built their entire culture on the idea that they were superior, that they could take what they wanted from lesser species. But humans had shown them something they couldn't understand or overcome: organized chaos. Elena stood in the assembly hall again, facing the same ambassadors who had doubted her 6 months ago. She looked different now. Still scarred, still rough around the edges, but there was satisfaction in her eyes. "The Chronari won't bother you again," she reported. They've classified this entire sector of space as psychologically hazardous and forbidden their fleets from entering. How? Felix asked, his crystalline form showing patterns of awe. How did one human accomplish what our combined fleets couldn't? Elena shrugged. You were trying to beat them at their own game. Superior firepower, better technology, larger fleets. But that's like trying to outswim a fish. Humans learned long ago that if you can't beat them at their game, you make them play yours. And what game is that? Ambassador Thrain inquired. Psychological warfare, Elena replied. Making your enemy defeat themselves. The Chronari's entire identity was built on being superior predators. We showed them what it's like to be prey. Not prey that runs or hides, but prey that fights back in ways they never imagined. We broke their confidence, and without confidence, bullies are just cowards with weapons. She picked up her beaten backpack, ready to leave. The refugee fighters I trained will keep up the pressure if the Chronari ever try to return. They're not soldiers, but that's what makes them effective. Soldiers think in terms of victory and defeat. Survivors think in terms of whatever works. As she walked toward the door, Lyra called out, Major Vasquez, the Assembly owes Earth a great debt. What can we offer in return? Elena stopped and turned back one last time. Just remember this moment the next time someone tells you violence doesn't solve problems. Sometimes it doesn't. But sometimes when you're dealing with those who only understand force, you have to speak their language. Just make sure you're better at it than they are. She left the station that day, returning to Earth with a message for humanity's leaders. The galaxy now knew what humans were capable of when pushed. Not just warriors or conquerors, but something far more dangerous. Problem solvers who didn't care about the rules. The story of the single human who stopped the Chronari raids spread throughout the galaxy, becoming legend. Different species told it different ways, but the core remained the same. When civilization failed, when honor meant nothing, when all hope seemed lost, Earth didn't send diplomats or generals or armies. Earth sent someone who understood that sometimes the best way to end a war is to make your enemy too afraid to start one. The Chronari never returned to assembly space. In their own histories, they recorded those 6 months as the madness, a time when they encountered a species that didn't just defeat them but fundamentally broke their understanding of how conflict worked, and somewhere in the vast expanse of human space, Major Elena Vasquez retired to a small colony world, where she grew vegetables and told stories to children about the importance of thinking differently. She never spoke of her mission to them, never mentioned the lives she'd saved or the empire she'd broken, because that's what humans did. They solved impossible problems, saved civilizations, and then went home to tend their gardens, leaving the galaxy to wonder what other impossible things humanity might do if the need ever arose again. The Assembly never called Earth for military aid again, not because they didn't trust humans, but because they understood now that human solutions, while effective, came from a place of darkness that most species couldn't comprehend. Humanity had evolved on a world that tried to kill them, had survived by becoming better killers, and had somehow emerged from that crucible with both compassion and ruthlessness in equal measure. It was a balance that terrified and fascinated the galaxy. And it was why, when new threats emerged, species would often ask themselves a simple question: what would the humans do? The answer was always the same: whatever it takes.